Welcome. This is Craig Applegath, and this is the first episode of the 21st Century Imperative, the podcast series that explores the insights and approaches of scientists, designers, planners, engineers, business entrepreneurs, and other successful change makers who are finding effective ways to meet the three critical challenges posed by the 21st Century Imperative. These are: how will we continue to live on our planet without destroying our biosphere? How will we repair and regenerate the environmental damage we have already caused? And how will we adapt to the escalating impacts of climate change? Each episode will feature an interview with an individual whom I think you will find not only inspiring, but also very relevant, helping you answer the question, what can I do to meet the challenges of the 21st Century Imperative? In this, our first episode, I have the pleasure of interviewing Jeff Schnurr, the chairman of Community Forest International and more recently the CEO of Jaza Energy. Jeff has a compelling story. After graduating from high school, he traveled in over 35 countries before landing in Tanzania, East Africa, where he began the tree planting initiative that grew into Community Forest International, also known as CFI. Starting with the dream of making conservation a rural livelihood, Jeff has spread the techniques of forest restoration around the globe, and CFI has planted over 1.5 million trees since he started in Pemba. In 2010, Jeff was named one of Canada's top 10 volunteers by the CBC and Manulife. More recently, Jeff launched Jaza Energy, an energy tech startup in East Africa, to build a network of renewable energy hubs in communities beyond the electrical grid. Each hub will provide affordable and reliable access to electricity in up to 100 households. In today's interview, we're going to talk to Jeff about how he started a sustainable forest NGO and how he sees his role as someone on the front lines of environmental harm reduction, regeneration, and climate adaptation, and what advice he would have for someone setting out to make a difference. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Jeff, thanks so much for making the time to do this podcast interview today. It's a real pleasure to have you as our first guest interview to help me kick off this podcast series. So let's set the stage for our listeners. If I remember correctly, after graduating from high school, you spent the next 4 years alternating between spending the summers planting trees in Canada to restore logging clear cuts and generate some money you needed to travel, and then traveling during the fall, winter, and spring months. During your travels, you managed to travel through Europe, India, and Southeast Asia, Mexico and Peru, Boston and New York City, Barcelona, and finally landing in Pemba, Tanzania. So tell us a story about why you decided to stay in Pemba and start Community Forest International.
Sure. Well, yeah, as you mentioned, I graduated from high school and didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, as many young people do. But I thought if I was going to be a part of the world, I had to see it first. So I did sort of start on this reckless journey of travel. And my aspirations were to actually write a novel. So I ended up in Pemba, Tanzania, and it's a small island off the Tanzanian coast, a part of Zanzibar. And I would just wake up every day, try and write a novel, slog through it for a few hours, and then go out into the street and drink coffee and try and speak some Swahili with the people I met. And after being there for about 10 months, I met an individual named Embark Musa Omar, who was this, originally a government employee, an accountant, who was this charismatic individual, just sort of bursting at the seams. And he approached me and he said, well, hey, you planted trees in Canada. He didn't care too much about the novel I was working on. And he said, well, let's plant trees here. Let's plant trees here in Pemba. So that was really what kicked everything off for me.
Since founding Community Forest International, you and your team have planted over 1.5 million trees. So What was the biggest hurdle you and your team faced in getting CFI going in Pemba?
Once you have an idea and you want to get something started, that's the easy part. Ideas come easy, and it was
all too easy.
It was, at first we had this idea that, well, communities, these rural communities would want to plant trees, and Embark and I would travel out there and we'd hold these big community meetings and we'd say like, hey everyone, we've got this idea, we can plant these trees for fruit and timber. And a lot of people just said like, no way. Like, why would we ever do that?
So at first there was some pushback because it was seen as being risky?
Well, we just went to a bunch of different communities, and there was enough people that finally said, yeah, that kind of makes sense. But initially, it was kind of the looking for the early adopters of, it doesn't seem high risk to us to maybe stop growing cassava or a staple crop and start growing and producing trees. But for the initial communities that decided that they wanted to grow trees, like, we didn't have a lot of money or any way to support them initially, so we were just collecting seed and starting nurseries in the center of these communities. And people said, like, other people in the community are gossiping about us. They're talking about us, saying, how are you going to eat your trees? How are you going to? And it was hard. And in those early years, we did have some early success. Like, we were able to grow 100,000 trees the first year, but there was also trees that there would be a insect outbreak or chickens in the nursery or goats eating 20,000 trees that were planted. And those were some real setbacks.
Why did Embark like the idea or think the idea of planting trees was a good thing to do? It wasn't just like, Jeff, you know about planting trees, let's go plant trees. Was there an environmental reasons? What underpinned it?
Well, originally, Embark had been involved with a marine conservation project that was actually based on Islamic ethics to drive conservation of marine resources. So the island of Pemba it's predominantly fishing is the main industry there. Everyone sort of goes into the ocean and catches their dinner or whatever they're going to sell at market. But at that time, I believe over the last decade, the annual marine catch had reduced by 25%. So they were seeing that people weren't making the livings that they were previously. So the initial inspiration behind the tree planting project was to both restore and make the landscape more productive, but also to find a way for people to build some type of way to make a living off the land as opposed to the ocean.
In our previous discussions, you had said that there had been a significant amount of deforestation on the island already.
Yeah, the sort of eastern half of the island was it's called a coral rag zone, very shallow coral. It's a coral island, so not a lot of soil. So once the trees were removed, there wasn't a lot of natural regeneration on large tracts of land. And it's not that they were worse at managing land, so they'd clear cut everything. It was literally just, there's 400,000 or 500,000 people on a 980 square kilometer space. They've been there for a lot longer.
So there was clearly a need when you arrived in the first place. Yeah.
There was a need, yeah.
When did you know that your fledgling organization, Community Forest International, was going to be a real success after you got it going?
Well, I worked with Embark to start some of these initial nurseries, and we kind of found some locals with a green thumb, and we hired a guy who had worked at the Department of Forestry. And I wasn't really planning on doing much beyond that. I came back to Canada, still planning on finishing that novel, and I came back here and planted trees again. And then Embark called me and he said, like, you have to come back. You have to come back and see this. So we had trees in the nursery, or we're starting the nurseries when I left. And then I returned back, and there was 100,000 trees in the nursery, and people were planting them. And it was, I don't think I've ever been that happy. Just walking around with a big smile on my face, completely out of my
element. Seeing all these trees that have been little wee seedlings, and now they're like 20 feet tall or whatever.
Well, yeah, and just seeing people walking across the landscape and putting trees on the ground, and realizing that moment, it was just an idea. And as I mentioned, ideas, there's a lot of them that come by, but when you see one take off and work and change how people behave and act, it was incredible.
This leads to another question I have about collaboration. I remember you saying to me once that collaboration and the ability to build on that collaboration was probably one of the most important things that led to the success of CFI. Tell me about a memorable example of this.
Well, I mean, I always believe that taking dreams seriously is the best way to get something done. And we saw, as I mentioned, incredible impact early on, but there was some large setbacks. And one community in particular, they lost 25,000 trees. They'd gone and they'd decided to change how they lived, changed how they worked, and it was devastating. It was a community called Infundo. And we went to the community and we were talking to them about how hard it was going to be that year. And then Embark called another community called Kiangoni, and he put them on speakerphone. So everyone in this village was kind of crowded around the nursery with 20,000 dead trees. And he called the next village and he said, hey, I'm here with the community of Fundo and we lost a lot of trees. Do you think you guys can help us out? There was sort of a long pause on the other line. And the guy's like, yeah, we can send 5,000 trees. And they did. They went with a bull cart and they moved 5,000 trees from one community to the next. And I mean, in terms of community to community collaboration, it was so powerful just to see that level of support, because the other village knew exactly what it took, what was required to make that sacrifice. And I think seeing that network of people that were committed to the same cause definitely sparked something within me, and then realized that we could grow that style of collaboration beyond one community to the next. We could do it largely across the globe. And
that's very much become part of your DNA.
Absolutely.
As an organization.
And realizing that you can learn something from anyone who's a part of that same vision and mission. And we learned a lot from our partners in Tanzania and applied that to what we do here in Canada and beyond.
And related to that, the issue of the North American going to Africa with special knowledge. Tell us a little bit about the problem of imported knowledge versus local knowledge. Specifically, I remember you telling me the story about your special shovels from Canada.
Absolutely. Well, there's a couple of stories I want to relate on that point. Like, first off, going into this, I didn't really want to help anyone, and I don't mean that from a selfish perspective, but I didn't believe that I could. And there was a point where I was walking with a community in that first year, and people kept saying, oh, what type of tree should we plant? What type of tree should we plant? Looking at me like I was this Canadian tree expert. And I was completely overwhelmed, but trying to act smart and trying to act like I knew. And I said, well, how about this tree? And I pointed to a cassava, which would be like walking through a farm here in Canada and saying, let's plant this tree, and pointing at a potato. Like, it's a tuber, it's a staple crop. And everyone just started laughing. They're kind of shaking their heads like, all right.
This guy really doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah, he keeps saying, I guess we are the experts. And I think that was empowering to realize, okay, well, we're, for some reason we're in this now, and, well, we have to decide what type of trees we plant. And of course, people knew. And the second story on that note, like, I came back to Canada. I'd seen the impact and I wanted to help. So I contacted the tree planting company that I'd worked for in Canada. And I said, hey, like, I've got this tree planting project. Can you donate gear? Can you donate equipment so I can go back and help? And I think as this sort of insecure foreigner in Africa, like, we often try and strive for relevancy. We often try and you're completely culture shocked. Like, in the early videos where I am in Tanzania and there's planting going on around me, like, I'm literally just like spinning circles with like, a smile on my face, but I just completely out of context, right? Like, so you do try and assert yourself in and say, you know what, like, I do know something, because you actually know nothing. You don't know the language. You don't know why people are shaking hands around you. You don't know what they're saying. You don't know how the culture works, how people interact, even the most basic things here that you think, oh yeah, I get that. I understand why that person's doing that. It just doesn't exist there. So often when people come from away and try and insert themselves into any context that they don't understand, they go and overassert their this idea of expertise. So I did this with shovels, and I showed up with these tree planting shovels, and we went and handed them out, and it was, me saying, okay, well, here's how we plant trees in Canada. And the first thing that it did is it actually limited the growth of the project, because people then started waiting for the fancy shovels.
Because they didn't think they could plant the trees with those special shovels.
Well, they were told by the expert from away that this is the way
this is what you do with these special shovels.
People around the world know how to dig a hole, right? It's completely ridiculous. And the second thing that
what happened to the shovels?
Oh, they just kind of disappeared into the ether. Eventually, because what we did is we realized, okay, we need to stop going around with these shovels. And, I remember
put
talking
them in
to
the back
team.
shed.
Yeah, talking to the team. They're like, we just need to lock these away. Pretend this never happened. And because the second thing is, when we plant trees in Canada, Canadians are very much, this is my 100 acres, stay off it. And we in the Canadian North, what you do is when you're planting trees, you have a piece of land that's yours, you mark off, demarcate it, and you plant it. And you're left there alone for, 10 hours, just in your own head, planting thousands of trees. What learned in Tanzania is where it was a very communal thing. Everyone was working together. They needed shared ownership built into the process to make sure that everyone in the community owned those trees. So everyone had to touch the tree. So one person would move it there, one person would go and set it down, another person would go dig the hole, and then a fourth person would come and plant the tree. And that was the security in saying, this is,
we all own it.
We all own it. Sometimes you go into these environments thinking that your way, yeah, sure, it worked for Canadian 20-somethings, but it was completely inappropriate for that use.
So a couple years later, in 2009, you and your team set up a Canadian branch of CFI in New Brunswick, Canada. Where does CFI fit into your 21st century imperative strategy?
I guess the imperative behind what we're trying to do, and my belief with where the world is going, there's we need to convert our forests and the land base around us as a carbon sink. We need to find a way to leverage everything we've got to store and sequester carbon that's already been released into the atmosphere. Even if all CO2 emissions were to halt right now, we'd still continue in a period of sort of runaway climate change.
Right.
So I fundamentally believe that our forests we need to get back to letting them do what they do best, which is help regulate our climate. And Community Forests International in Canada very much works to that end. So what we do in Canada is try and build relationships with an economic incentive or an economic driver that allow people conserving land or working on land, or people with forest land, to make sure that forest remains intact and continue to do what nature does best.
And in addition to pulling back on the harm that we're causing the environment through CO2 emissions, which forests absorb, sequester, what about climate adaptation? What do you guys see as your role in helping to adapt to the impacts of climate change?
Well, one thing that we learned in Tanzania was that conservation needed to become a day job. So everyone that was planting trees in Tanzania, they said, hey, we're doing this. They would call it conservation. They would say we're restoring our land, we're conserving our forests, but they were all making a living doing it. Some of the trees were cut, fruit was harvested, and that may not seem groundbreaking now, but 10 years ago, that there wasn't a lot of people talking about how we need to combine sort of economic development and environmental conservation. And that's what we learned in Tanzania. So from an adaptation perspective, I think at the core, being able to take ideas from around the world and share them very quickly like we came back to Canada and realized, well, we needed to conserve forests, but people needed to make a living doing it. We couldn't just lock it up and throw away the key and say, hey, come for a hike on the weekend. We needed to both include the people that were making their living in that conservation strategy. So from an adaptation perspective, one thing that I fundamentally believe is we need to speed up the rate in which ideas and information is exchanged between practitioners on the front lines of conservation, or people within that are actually living it and walking the talk. And that's very much what you're trying to do with this podcast, right? Is to try and get the ideas out there so they can be accelerated and spread very quickly.
One of the biggest roadblocks to moving forward is the intangibleness of climate change, especially in Canada. I mean, climate change seems to be just warmer springs and not such snowy winters. So it's hard to get that kind of buy-in, that visceral buy-in. What about in Pemba? Was there more of a sense that climate change was real? Were
Absolutely.
they seeing it in everyday life and in the environment around them in ways that we don't seem to be?
Very apparent. And I mean, a lot of Canadians don't like make their living from the land anymore, right? So like we're
isolated by
we're isolated, absolutely.
Plastic
and like,
covered, wrapped up meat and vegetables with elastics around them.
Absolutely. And if the river runs dry like for a little bit longer into the summer here, like no one in Toronto is talking about it. Where we work in Tanzania, everyone is. It's like everyone is talking about like, oh, did you see that? Like the water levels are low, or like there was a storm surge last night. The water was like coming a little further up in the ports, and like people are so in tune to what's happening because they all depend on the environment for their livelihood. And here it's like you maybe when you're taking the elevator, there's a monitor up there showing you some extreme weather event. You're just like, wow, that's crazy. Ding, off the elevator.
Tell us about the Rural Innovation Center. You set one up first in Pemba and then one in New Brunswick as a way of disseminating information and bringing people together to understand all of the issues related to both environmental rehabilitation and climate change and so forth.
Well, what we realized in Tanzania, we'll work with 35 communities at a time. And they have 2 growing seasons there, so we actually really kind of can run 60 experiments a year. And the people that were actually in the field, whether pioneering new agricultural systems that were more resilient by mixing tree species with perennial food-producing systems, or people that were planting trees, experimenting with new species, were able to learn things, and they would and most land use knowledge is actually intergenerational. Like your parents do something for their lifetime, and then you pick it up, and 20 years down the road you've got a next set of results. But what we could almost, in terms of it's like a respiration where you've got people out in these fields that can then come to a centralized location, share knowledge very quickly, and then go back to their communities. And every time people would come to a centralized location like the Rural Innovation Campus, they would then leave with the confidence of knowing like, wow, I've got something new, something additional I can take back to my communities. And it was a real confidence booster, which often when you're toiling away in the landscape, like no one knows if you've done something cool. Right. So it was really about highlighting people that had done something that was remarkable, or people that were pioneers or leaders in their community. And
Pemba's an island off of Tanzania, so there were people coming from the mainland as well.
Yeah, we've brought people from the mainland, or we brought experts from Kenya, people from largely in the region to come and also be a part of that exchange. And in Canada, the concept is fairly similar, where we can host workshops or events that bring together the people that are living in the back 40, these homesteaders, these people that are building their timber frame homes or pushing for these permaculture orchards, and they can come, and it really, like, for people that are in such isolation, once again, doing things that are largely on behalf of society, building resiliency and providing these essential ecosystem services through their conservation and their stewardship of largely their homes. No one cares. No one knows until they come to a place like the Rural Innovation Campus and they can share what worked for them and meet with a community. And I think that's what it's all about.
Do you think that in the 10 years since you and your team got together and started CFI, that you've seen a material change in people's understandings of how they can affect their environment and how they can sort of push back against the impacts of climate change and modify their environment in a positive way? I mean, it's not, as opposed to you just saying it, is it more like a cultural shift?
Well, I think, if you just say something enough, it becomes cultural, right? And that's kind of the beauty of highlighting things that work, and you repeat it enough. And you say, hey, there's a different way we're doing it. Especially in the Canadian context or our Tanzanian colleagues, they're constantly hearing, oh, climate change, like it's harder. And it's very easy to take a very pessimistic viewpoint, which you should be afraid. You should be, I'm not saying gloss over the harsh realities, but to then go in Tanzania and say like, hey, Bijuma down the road there is like, she's putting her kids through college off of the food she's producing through this mixed restoration agricultural approach. Like, it's really cool. Like that matters. Same in Canada. Like, well, we're now selling carbon offsets and we're restoring a forest, and we've got this amazing resource, and like, you should come see it, and you walk through it and you feel it. And that's how you do change cultures, is just highlighting those things and talking about it through repetition. And then it's just like, it's in your toolkit. It's there. People are aware of it.
I've known you for about 5 years since we started our carbon offset project. And it struck me that it's CFI and yourself have been a huge success story. Tell me about any mistakes or places where it just didn't work, where you tried to do something and you were going for a particular result and it failed. And was it a learning experience? Was it just something you put beside you or behind you?
Well, I take rejection and failure very well. And I probably only do that because I'm like, the only time I don't is when I have no other options or nothing else on the go, right? Like, I'm a fairly diversified individual in terms of the scope of things, that the interests that I pursue. So half the time when things don't work out, I probably don't even really notice. But no, all kidding aside, things that haven't worked out, I mean, nothing ever works out the way I planned. Let's put it that way. There's never like you read things on a Medium blog post, or you hear things on a podcast, and you're just like, wow, that just like, it just sounds so easy.
They set their vision, and in 5 years they accomplished it.
Exactly. They just moved through it, checked the boxes, the money came in and it all worked. Nothing's ever been pretty. Nothing's ever been textbook that we've done. Whether it was like we set out to conserve a property in New Brunswick called Welcome Farm that was fairly historic in New Brunswick, sort of draft dodger types, sort of pioneers in the organic agriculture movement, asked us to take on their property and continue it. And we agreed to raise the money. And like, we've written hundreds of proposals. We've done so much in trying to raise funds for that project. And it was, I think we received $5,000 through bake sales, and eventually we built the carbon partnership with Dialogue, and we're able to find a way to quantify the carbon stored on that property. But the amount of just the timing and things, it was kind of, we agreed to buy the property, and it was, kind of years in the making. And I think that's everything. We experience setbacks in almost everything we do, but we succeed in the things that we stick with. And, when you're a social entrepreneur and innovator, you get to decide when you stop. And that's in your power. Nothing else is in your power. Nothing. But the moment where you say all right, I'm done, that's up to you. And, no one ever tries to do something for 10 years and gets worse at it.
Jaza Energy. You are now embarking on a new venture to start an off-grid renewable energy company in East Africa. Tell me about why you have started this new venture and what you think the success for that venture looks like.
Well, yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I have the belief that our forests need to be converted or leveraged into carbon sinks, or ways that we can store the carbon in the atmosphere. I also believe we can't put much more carbon into the atmosphere. And there's 1.2...
We're already at over 400
We're over
parts
our
per
budget,
million.
for sure. And there's 1.2 billion people living globally without access to electricity. And access to electricity is, it's a human right. Like, people should have electricity. There's no other metric that could drive more positive change per household globally. But if they electrify with coal, we're cooked. Like, we can't take 1.2 billion people in terms of being electrified with fossil fuels. It's just like the planet's done. Just game over. So that kind of has forced me to look very seriously about how we can play a part in, and there is some inroads happening. It's just not happening fast enough. So I do believe like we have to do it and have to try. And success in terms of what that project looks like, we do plan on electrifying 5,000 communities in the next 5 years. And the thing I really like about that project is we're looking at people in last mile communities in sub-Saharan Africa as almost customers, where they get to decide if the service works for them, if they prefer solar energy to kerosene for lighting or any other type of electricity, because I do believe it can compete, and I do believe people can make the choice and opt in to a better solution that is sustainable and then drive that change. Whereas a lot of time when people think of sub-Saharan Africa, they think of aid and they think of going and helping people. But I do believe that people in last mile communities have actually not really been treated with the dignity of being a customer, where they have the right to put you out of business if you aren't providing a quality service. So Jaza Energy it's a last mile solar energy company looking to provide a service that both improve and empower our customers to live the lives they want to live.
Describe what it looks like. How does the off-grid system work?
Yeah, it's
just as a sort of technical geek, I sort of have a sense of what this thing looks like.
Well, it's an energy hub. So we've either built our own buildings or put a solar array on a school or a mosque. That powers it's kind of like a solar-powered vending machine.
A solar-powered vending machine?
Yeah, it's like an energy vending machine where you've got this energy hub. Every household in the community will get a motorcycle battery, which is like a mini power wall.
Yeah.
So they wire their own homes with lighting kits that we can provide, and then they approach the vending machine and they use mobile banking to pay for a charge and carry their battery home, plug it in, and get lights, in-home electricity, and cell phone charging. So it's a very low-cost way where just like people go to the well for water, they come to us for electricity. But it's completely modular, so as energy demand increases, we can just build out the system. We can wire homes into the energy hub as well if people want a wired connection. So it's very flexible, but it's sort of the gateway energy that gets people started, and then we can grow as their demands change, because right now people just
and
want
they
to
can be the first to start using power over Ethernet as well.
That's right. Yeah. So there's some other sort of along the technology roadmap is looking at how we can use different ways to connect the homes through both providing electricity and potentially data through the energy hub model.
So this isn't just about Pemba. This is about potentially all over the developing world.
Yeah, we're going to work in East Africa initially, in Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and then see where we can grow beyond there.
This is a good point to segue into talking about the bigger picture on how we're going to address the 21st century imperative. You've spent the past 10 years of your life creating an NGO whose animating purpose is to repair the environment and help adapt to climate change. In doing so, You have dealt with other NGOs, the government of Tanzania, the government of New Brunswick, the government of Finland, the European Union, the United Nations. This has no doubt given you a very broad perspective of the challenges and opportunities for us to really address what you and I agree is a 21st century imperative. So what do you think? Are we going to be able to get our shit together as a species? I know this is an impossible question, but how are we going to do it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mention all those sort of stakeholders, or the both government institutions, civil society, private sector leaders. One thing that I have observed is there's very much a scarcity mentality around solutions. So even people that have good ideas want the credit for it. They want to be known, recognized, and they almost treat that like a trade secret. Or there's a lot of ownership over solutions in that space. And you'll see the sort of eco-celebs, the people that want to be paraded around the conference circuit or what have you. And, I
suspect they just want to be more than actors.
Yeah, well, and I don't want to be too cynical, but I think that even looking at a cultural or a mentality shift within practitioners in the solution space, and trying to move to almost a culture of abundance in terms of how we deal with ideas, and looking once again back to how we can share and proliferate what works as quickly as possible with in as egoless scenario as possible too. Just like I know how to plant trees in Canada. When I went to Tanzania, my approach was stifling because I wanted to be relevant. And I think we have to take ideas to the exchange and let them go and be adapted into other contexts. And they can't sometimes take us along with them, and that's fine. But if humans are going to survive this, I think we need to get over ourselves and realize that this is a greater problem than one individual or one community. Take your success, but try and celebrate it in a way that it can be shared, packaged, and applied somewhere else.
And is there something in the balance between grassroots action versus top-down elite expertise? I mean, both are needed, but you guys are the grassroots response very effectively. What do you think the balance is there?
Well, I think it all has to be a part of the same conversation, and what works needs to be supported by policy. I think that policies can do a great job, like to incentivize, Germany with renewable energy. Like, they basically subsidize the entire world's shift to renewables just by building the incentive that led to a manufacturing boom in the solar space. And now, China's can't find enough places to put solar panels, and that those type of conversations between both policy practitioners, research, innovators, science, I think it all needs to be there. It's not really an either or, it's a both.
Yeah.
And I think that we've seen some great successes of that, but it's sometimes hard to coordinate, but I think it's definitely got to happen.
Yeah, and sometimes when I'm wrestling with a really difficult problem, I'll ask myself, what am I missing? What's going on that I can't see? What do you think is missing from the discussion of climate change? Are there other questions or better questions that we should be asking ourselves?
Well, I think the thing with climate change, it's so abstract. I think
you can't feel it, touch it, taste it.
You can't feel it, touch it, taste it. But I think it's really like the conversation around humans in being so destructive leads to such a negative feeling, and feeling disenfranchised and feeling helpless, and just be like, oh, the bees are gone and the forests are being cleared and industrial agriculture. And just the weight of that just makes you feel like we've just messed up. And I think the shift needs to be like, humans are a restorative force, reimagining our place as
a positive force as opposed to the pathological parasite.
Yeah. I mean, if you just look from a historical context, like 100 years ago or 50 years ago, the previous generation, how do we grow enough food to feed the planet? How do we get these resources? How do we wrestle them from the earth? And how do we industrialize this? We need to grow. That was the challenge of the time. It was how do we get things out of the earth and use them? Because
the earth was infinite.
Yeah, and we weren't that good at it, right? Like we didn't have all the ability. So we figured that out. And now it's figuring out, well, we are the same people that can figure out how to get resources from around the world and build a completely globalized, connected network of humans, whether it's the exchange of good or the exchange of information. Like, that's brilliant. We did that. It's not the change that we need to make. It's the next step, using that same ingenuity to become a restorative force that can kickstart a widespread, this almost catalyze this healing process across the globe. Like, we can do it. And I think that needs to be the conversation.
And I think your success in Pemba is so illustrative of that. There's that real sense of positivity as opposed to going in to solve a problem. It was more in going in to find opportunities to improve what they already had and help them realize that they could be a positive force in the environment.
And just celebrating the things that worked and championing those causes.
What about the notion of progress? I think a lot of people who care about our planet implicitly believe in it, but lately that belief is being severely tested, as we're all seeing with Brexit and the rise of the right in Europe, and most recently the election of Trump in the States, are all giving progressives and liberals great anxiety about progress. What do you think about the idea of progress, and what do we need to do to move it forward?
Well, I think progress is always, almost that dialectical materialism between the everything we're seeing on the right and the Brexit, the protectionism, the nationalism. Like there's not really any problem that nationalism would be a solution to in our time, right? Like it's not.
Yeah.
It's not.
And yet it seems to be the thing that is now animating people.
It's been activated just from fear of the pace of change, and it's really it's a response. It's that things are moving too fast. Let's go back to a much simpler time, right? And it is that fear, and I wish
the fear of today.
Yeah, the fear of today, and I wish the swings weren't so extreme, but things are going to move back in the other direction. I just don't think change is always up and to the right. It's hard. It's hard when you know things must move faster, and you believe in a world that you just don't see, and everything seems to be moving in the complete opposite direction. But I think that's a response to how much has happened in the last 5 years in terms of change on the global stage, and I think we'll swing back in the opposite direction.
One of the most memorable and meaningful books I read as a young man was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I remember one of the key things he said was, those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. When we look at all of Earth's environmental vital signs, our current predicament is, by any measure, quite dire, obviously. So what gives you hope? What keeps you going?
I mean, the people that I've been able to work with that, by all accounts, should be hopeless. And the spark that you see in the farmer, the person working in forestry, the person that's just questioning and striving for more and asking themselves why, and then able to make that change. Like I believe that, I mean, it's just when you see these people around the world and the people you work with being able to pull things off and make that impact, it's incredibly inspiring. And for me, in terms of why, like, I couldn't live for anything else. Like, I see a problem, and I'm now starting this solar energy initiative in sub-Saharan Africa, and you look at the stats and it's like, well, 1 in every 10 businesses fail, and startups are hard, and it's just like, well, have the courage.
Right.
I think we lack that courage, especially as Canadians. I think we do. And even the business community, like, your business needs to be solving a real pain point, right? Why not solve the biggest pain points? Like, it's hard for people to share photos on an app, like, so build a better app. Like, that's just, I just think it lacks courage. And I think we should take on the biggest problems and realize, well, let's use everything at our disposal And I think it's just what do you want to succeed at? Set the compass and go for it.
So what advice would you offer listeners about what they can do to be part of making a difference and having the courage to make a difference to meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative?
I think that there are habits that you can form around just like, you don't have to start with a huge initiative. Like I didn't try and start Community Forest International. We tried to help a community or two grow some trees, and it was a small group at the first. We didn't know it was going to grow and continue, but just picking that small problem, anything that you can do, and build the habit of striving for a solution and seeing it through on the smallest scale you can. And once you get in the cycle of seeing something and striving for a solution, holding yourself accountable to making that change on a very small scale, you ingrain that habit and it just grows over time.
Let's shift gears a bit. I'd like to ask you a couple of hypothetical questions, just to sort of wrap up. If you had a chance to return in time to visit yourself when you were starting CFI, what key piece of advice would you give yourself in light of what you know now about the world?
Give myself probably get more sleep because you're going to need it. Well, I think when I did start, I was also scared to reach out. I was scared to try and become a part of a greater community, or, I was 21 at the time. I think I would tell myself to keep that naivety, keep that idea, and yeah, I don't know, like we went for it and the sky was the limit, and it didn't work out maybe the way exactly how we all imagined it would, but it worked.
So it sounds like your younger self didn't need any different advice whatsoever.
Well, other than the sleep more and don't you do have a bit
enjoy
more.
Enjoy the moment more.
Yeah, and if your family comes to town and you don't necessarily need to just work on that proposal. You can stop for half an hour and go eat dinner with them or whatever. I think I was so wrapped up in what I was doing that I probably ignored a lot of people around me, and you realize that, now sort of 10 years into it, that I could have taken a bit more time. But
final question. If you were given a full-page spread in the Sunday New York Times to publish any graphic or written material you wanted, what would you do with it?
Any graphic or written material in the New York Times? Well, I think recently the trends on the cost of solar energy versus the cost of coal production. If you look at those graphs, I think it just, not even looking at the trends of what's happening in the climate, not the scare tactic, but I just think it's so empowering to see how the things that are sustainable and renewable and regenerative over time, the more of us that participate, the more accessible things come.
That's very cool. Why don't we finish by leaving that image in our listeners' heads? Thanks very much, Jeff. You can find links to more information about Jeff and Community Forest International, and to notes about what we discussed in this podcast at tfcipodcast.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.